about it.
Awesome.
Yeah. So tonight,
What's our topic for today?
I want to talk about responsibility and what that means, because it kind of can get confusing sometimes for people in terms of what are they responsible for, when do they become responsible, and so on. So we'll dig into that a little bit, and then as usual, we can talk about that in the comments and questions that follow, or we can talk about whatever you'd like to talk about. So what is personal responsibility in addiction? You know, we've had several models over the years. The old one, the original one, probably was the moral model, which basically in shorthand said, you know, I caused this problem and I'm responsible for solving it. And the moral problem pretty much framed addiction in a moral framework, weak moral character, that kind of thing. And so there was some progress, I think, when we moved into the medical model, which is basically I didn't cause it, but I am responsible for solving it. And I think that's the approach of 12-step program. That's the approach of a lot of people right now, including myself, in that the sources of addiction are many and the causes are many. And sometimes we do things as addicts that ultimately we're responsible for, sometimes in a legal way or in a moral way or ethical way, but we may not be totally aware of what we're doing, or there's a denial that's so strong that interferes with it. But I think the bottom line for me is that once I become aware of my addiction, of the potential for it, of the acts that I've caused, then it is my responsibility. There's no going back. And really there's no getting away from things I did anyway. But in a more of a clinical point of view, I think that point of absolute responsibility starts once there's a realization that there is an addiction going on. So I think that's kind of one thing to talk about. The critics of 12-step program often say that the people that go to 12-step program turn responsibility over to the program, that they're kind of skipping out on the responsibility. And I don't agree with that. I think the 12-step program is a support system, but in every sense, the addict remains responsible for the behavior. So I think it's kind of a misinterpretation of what exactly that the steps mean in terms of acceptance and turning things over. So that statement, "I am powerless," the famous words, "I am powerless," doesn't abdicate the person from responsibility at all. They're powerless over the addiction. And that basically is responsibility, right? To me, is like saying, okay, this thing is bigger than me, this addiction to whatever it is. I am responsible for not activating it, for not going there, for taking care of myself, taking care of people that could be affected by it. So I think that's a really important piece. We also see this, by the way, with partners, I think, who often, out of love and caring, take on probably more responsibility than they should. I think it's a classic that addicts shirk responsibility to some extent. Sometimes they're in a fog. Sometimes it's outright being obstinate. But I think it's true generally that partners sometimes have the opposite problem in terms of taking less responsibility and letting go a little bit more. So I want to kind of frame two sets of factors that affect, I think, responsibility. So factors that diminish personal responsibility. And this is going to give the impression, it's kind of where I'm coming from, is that this is not always black and white. There are factors that kind of make this a little smudgy. So I want to start with factors that diminish personal responsibility and then factors that augment it. So one of the factors that diminishes personal responsibility in addiction are comorbid or co-occurring psychiatric or medical conditions. So we know that someone who is bipolar, for example, will go out and have a lot of high-risk, unprotected sex in a way that looks just like sex addiction. However, the origins of it are not quite the same. It's really induced by a thought disorder and a mood disorder that's driving this behavior, not so much an addictive process. We might see a medical condition associated. There's been really interesting studies by Kaiser and some other large medical groups that have access to thousands of records where certain kinds of drugs are associated with certain kinds of medical conditions. So, for example, alcoholics tend to have a comorbid or co-occurring cardiovascular disease, or injuries, stroke, opiates or opioids, as you might imagine, chronic pain, arthritis, sometimes Hep C, musculoskeletal. So there are these associations that kind of predict, to some extent, the use of drugs. Now, one of the classic denials that every addict tries at some point in their career is that, well, the doctor prescribed it, so it must be okay. And, that ain't okay. Doctors prescribe a lot of stuff, and doctors have, 3 hours of addiction education over their medical education. So we have to use common sense in that regard as addicts. Other factors that kind of change some of this responsibility piece: genetic predisposition. We know that this runs in families. There are genes that kind of set people up for certain kind of addictive disorders. Now, does that abdicate responsibility? No, but it means that I need to be highly aware of what's going on in my family and to kind of get a clue about what I might be at risk for. Adverse early environmental factors. So we've talked on this webinar before about adverse childhood experiences, which can be everything from all kinds of abuse, sexual, verbal, physical, bullying. It can be neglect. It can be some kind of family dysfunction of whatever origin. So those kind of things add up, along with trauma, to really affect the opportunity for addiction to take hold. And again, I think sometimes that can take hold and blossom in someone before they really kind of understood what has happened. But the moment, again, of clarity has to be, okay, I do have this addiction. Now it's my responsibility to take it in hand. Other things, socio or cultural, I guess what we might call dissonance. I'm a gay man. I live in the gay community. There's just a whole lot more drinking and probably more drugging in the gay community. That's kind of the social norm. So I've had many clients say, well, to every gay person's, drinking 8 beers or, having 2 bumps of meth or whatever. It's just kind of what we do. And the same thing, by the way, happens with sex and sex addiction. And a lot of gay men saying, well, this is just who we are. This is my sexual freedom. But in reality, there's an addictive process going on. And then the last thing I think that can kind of reduce or diminish personal responsibility is what we would call, not to be too technical, but iatrogenic causes, which simply means doctor-caused problems. So I can't tell you how many clients I've had over the years who would come with all these prescriptions for example, benzodiazepines, Valium and Xanax, and just the doctors routinely giving them this for anxiety. Then they start to have rebound from developing tolerance on one of those, they'd get on something else, and just the doctors keep kind of adding. So I think there's really a medical, it's not malpractice, but it's not good practice in that regard. So I think sometimes, and I have seen clients come in just totally messed up and not understanding why. And the why was because they were on all kinds of prescription medications that they didn't be on. I think often, instead of doing an annual, which is the best practice for them, an annual reconciliation of medication, doctors often just add. And when we go to specialists, they're not even really paying attention to what other doctors might be doing. So they're prescribing drugs that really counteract or add to the problems we see. So what factors increase personal responsibility in addiction? One is kind of similar to the first one, awareness of the problem. And this, of course, is an issue of denial, which is common. But this is where I would not just say awareness, but acceptance. This is the acceptance of a problem, something that I have that I have to deal with. And I think that process is sometimes short, sometimes long for an addict. My own journey, I would rather have been, I remember thinking this, I'd much rather have a mental illness than be an alcoholic. And then that one didn't fly. And I thought, well, I needed something to love. So I got a cat, which ended up crazed, and joke about needing Alapet. I thought my diet was wrong. So I became a vegetarian. There wasn't vegans back in those days. I thought, gee, if I quit smoking, that'll help. I thought maybe I have too much time. So I went to graduate school, got a master's degree in the evenings, still found time to drink and drug. So basically my denial was all these things that finally fell through, and I was left with the really rude awareness that I was an addict. And that was the acceptance for me. And that's really where my kind of demarcation point of responsibility really takes place. Factors that augment knowledge of genetic predisposition. We talked about that as a risk factor, but I remember a client who talked about this family, his family, just riddled with alcoholics. All his siblings, all of his aunts and uncles, his parents, his grandparents on both sides, just everywhere, except his one aunt, who seemed to have escaped this horrible burden of alcoholism. And I think she even kind of taunted the rest of the family. And in her 80s, she started having liver problems. They found she'd been a closet alcoholic all the years too. So I mean, there is something to be said for family history. But once we are aware of it, I think really it's incumbent. And there's family, no family is unaware of addictive history. And I think that's really critical to understand that is a really predictive process. Other things that augment, understanding the addictive process, the addictive cycle. I think sometimes we just see the acting out as the problem, and we kind of don't recognize the buildup, whether it's kind of an erotic sexual desire buildup or an urge for drugging, be based on numbing or seeking excitement, the shame that follows the acting out. It's a regular predictable cycle. And I think it's incumbent on us as addicts to be aware of how that plays out in our lives, because it is predictable. And finally, things that I think increase responsibility for an addict is the availability of good treatment, which is something that we have a problem with in this country, really an access to treatment. And I will add to that medical treatment and psychiatric treatment. I live in South Florida. We have a pretty dense medical system, and we have a terrible shortage of psychiatrists. And to get a psychiatrist that will deal with addiction is nearly impossible. So there's these kind of barren deserts of medical specialties, even in an urban area, that are affecting people's ability to get the care they need. But so those are kind of the factors. My point is that responsibility lies squarely on the addict. And we're not responsible, I think, for being an addict. We're not responsible for our genes, for the trauma we experience as kids. In recovery, we're not responsible for sexual urges or drug triggers or drug cues. They're going to come up. Just like I use a parallel with my clients of dreams. You're not responsible for what you dream about, but you are responsible for what you do with it. And the same way, trigger. If I get a trigger or cue to use a drug, my responsibility is not to go act out on it. My responsibility is to do something productive and healthy with it, to call my sponsor, or to get to a meeting, or to call somebody, or to take some action that pushes me further into recovery. So that's one final point that I always want to make with my clients too, is that we're not responsible for not having thoughts about acting out, thoughts about drugs. We are responsible for doing something really quickly to not go down that road, because there is this inevitability piece. The more we play around with those thoughts, the more we kind of tinker with them, the more inevitable it is that we will at some point use or act out. So that's where responsibility is, and how we manage those triggers and cues. So, Scott?
Thank you, David. As far as the medical model, I just wanted to add, sometimes people think, oh, medical model, there's a cure, there's a pill, there's, not so much. Addiction is much more like diabetes, where there's no cure. You can manage it with daily effort, but there's no cure. Once you're an addict, you're always an addict. You can't unbake the cake. The cake is baked. The cucumber is pickled, whatever metaphor you want to use. We've got a couple questions already, so I'll put mine on hold, and we'll go with the questions in the queue. Feel free, everybody, use the Q&A feature to ask questions about responsibility, and also about anything else that you have questions about. So our question number one here is, if one is convinced that he or she is an addict, how does one heal the root cause rather than just try to white knuckle a change of outward behavior? Good question.
I'm just look. I don't see that one here. Scott, can you read it one more time? Sorry.
I muted myself because I was coughing. If you're an addict, how do you heal the root cause rather than just white knuckling?
Okay, that's a great question. And I would say with every addiction I've ever seen, in my friends and myself and my family and my clients, there are root causes that are going on. And I think I learned from years of unproductive white knuckling that it doesn't really work. You can kind of hang on. Sometimes you can go a period of time without using or acting out, but your quality of life is going to be pretty miserable, and it's not going to be an experience that you want to repeat. I think that sets the stage to fail. What I think we have to do eventually is to deal with some of those root causes, and it's really critical to underline and underscore that too many people try to jump into that work too soon. It's really heavy-duty work. If we're going back and dealing with trauma, with sexual abuse or emotional abuse or profound neglect as children, that's heavy-duty stuff. And a newly recovering addict really needs to just focus on getting clean, getting sober, getting their recovery plan in place, getting their support networks, their sponsors, their connections, keeping it really simple. And even in our treatment models at Seeking Integrity, we don't get into the trauma work very soon because we understand that clients can't handle it. They need to be stabilized. They need to have a container where they can learn tools to self-regulate and to manage uncomfortable feelings that pop up. Because what an addict does, if you think about it, our primary coping mechanism is to manage those uncomfortable feelings with some addictive behavior. And that can be to distance ourselves from it, to numb it out. It can be sometimes to enhance intensity, to kind of ignore it and escape from it. So dipping into those early things too soon is really dangerous. That said, I think the steps provide a really great avenue and progression that we can develop and work with and not get into stuff too soon. If you look at the steps, there's steps like making amends, even taking a personal inventory. They're not right up in front, right? It requires some recovery time under your belt. But at the time, I've seen quality of recovery can really stall when at the appropriate time, and that could be a year, could be 2 years, some people maybe 6 months, 9 months. The time comes to start working on that stuff because it starts to fuel potential for relapse. Or the person, I've seen this in program too, where somebody may not be using or acting out, but they haven't done the work and they're angry or they're unfriendly or they're just miserable, even though they're clean and sober. And so I think that's where that work starts to be evident. But I don't push that with clients. I think I talk about I use the metaphor of putting all that stuff up on the shelf and waiting till it falls off. And it will. You'll know when it's ready. I think if you get into it too soon, it's just trouble.
Yeah, I would add that when I first got into recovery, I wanted to know, why am I an addict? Who can I blame? When will they apologize and make amends? And restitution and all that good stuff. But what I really wanted to know was, why am I an addict? And my therapist at the time said, let's put that on the back burner and deal with the fact that you are an addict. Your coping mechanism is alcohol, drugs, and sex. Maybe we should find some better coping mechanisms. And once you establish some sobriety and can do the painful work of figuring out what underlies your addiction and stay sober at the same time, which is incredibly difficult. As David said, it's really hard work to uncover trauma, early life trauma. And I found out, I learned in my recovery that, my childhood was not as rosy as I thought it was. there was a lot of abuse and trauma, and this weekend, David just took his 40-year chip, by the way. Congratulations, David.
Thank you.
I'm taking my, are you going to show it? You got it in there? I'm taking my 15-year sobriety chip on Sunday.
I'll look for it. Keep talking for a second.
All right. I'm still digging and peeling back layers of the onion. So yeah, don't be in such a huge hurry, but it's probably some unresolved early life trauma, neglect, abuse, bullying, whatever. So yeah.
And I would say too, I've had so many clients over the years want to know why, and they can find out why, but it doesn't do anything to change the problem. That why, it has to be really dealt with at an emotional level, not an intellectual level. We know the answer. Sometimes we know the answer right away, but knowing the answer doesn't help us change the behavior in any way whatsoever. So that's an important piece. I just want to take a break and show you I don't know if you can see the Roman numeral 40 there.
Awesome.
This is 2/3 of my life right here. So yeah, I'm really proud of that. Okay.
So we actually have a little question in the chat. Somebody wants to know where you practice in Florida. This person lives in Tampa.
Oh, hi. I'm in Fort Lauderdale. I live in Fort Lauderdale, but I don't practice here anymore. I'm working full-time at Seeking Integrity.
Which is in Los Angeles.
It's in Los Angeles, right. So I have a bit of a commute every day.
Yeah.
I'm going back and forth as time permits. So not practicing here, but living here still, loving it.
Okay, so we've got some more questions here. This one, I'm a woman, sex, and love addict. I've been in recovery and sober from Bottom Lines for 6 months. Congratulations. I teach at a university. A year and a half ago, I matched with an advanced grad student, but I told him we couldn't date. We have maintained a friendship, in quotation marks, with a lot of intellectual intimacy. Well, he'll be finished with this program next week. I truly think it's best to remain just friends, but I wish I could stop fantasizing and obsessing about him. Any insights?
Well, sex and love addiction is all about that fantasy, right? The fantasy about what might be, often to the exclusion of who the person really is. We impose on people these romantic fantasies and aspirations. I like the fact that you said intellectual intimacy, because I think I should do a webinar on intimacy one night, because there's many different kinds of intimacy. We think of course, partner intimacy and that kind of communication, but I think you can have intimacy on an intellectual level. You can have spiritual intimacy. You can have all kinds of intimacy that's important. But so there's that connection. You had obviously a very real connection with that intellectual bond. But now it's coming to an end. And so I think, oops, there goes my 40-year coin. I think it's really important to let that go, just because those kind of fantasies don't always merge well with reality or even potential for reality. And I think fantasy in general for addicts tends to pull them out of their lives. It's like daydreaming. It's a dissociation. And so if I find myself, I don't have those kind of fantasies so much, but if I'm daydreaming a lot or just kind of thinking about a trip, my fantasy, I'm at that age, I guess, I'd rather think about Paris than some hot person. But I sort of get off on thinking about what I might do on my next trip to Paris or something like that. And I realize that's kind of an escape from my life, and that's okay to an extent. But I think if we have a background of addiction and sex and love addiction, that can be really tricky, and it can pull you right out of your life and cause problems. So I'd encourage you to get support from your friends and your support network, and really work your program and check your motivation. See if you can get underneath that and see what's really going on. Because I think with any kind of addictive behavior, including sex and love addicts, it's not always about that person or even the fantasy. It's about other things. So I'd take it as an opportunity to work on yourself. In a way, the fact that he's leaving is going to break up this pattern, and that's a good thing, I think, because it'll give you a chance to reflect, maybe get some objectivity and see. So, yeah.
Yeah, it's sex addiction and love addiction are all about the fantasy. There's a quote, addicts are escaping a reality from which they are not. We don't live in the real world because it makes us uncomfortable. Now, there may be a real connection there, and if there is, great. David hit it on the head. Run it past your support system. Because neither David nor I, in a session like this, can really dig into the depth of that.
Right.
So yeah. Questions coming in today. The book, The Sober Truth, written by Dr. Lance Dode, claims only 10% of people attending 12. Did you hear my hiss? Only 10% of people attending 12-step programs stay sober and don't relapse. Have you read this book? Have you examined Smart Recovery as an alternative to the 12-step program? How wedded is Seeking Integrity to the 12-step program?
Okay, good question. Yeah, I don't know the book. I haven't read the book. I've heard of it, but I haven't read it. The statistics for recovery are really tricky because recovery is defined as different things to different people. And I have heard similar statistics, even more grim than that, 5%, 10%. With methamphetamine, it gets pretty low as well. There are people, some anecdotal word that a lot of people just recover kind of spontaneously without any program. So my experience, and that's all I can really speak from both clinically and personally, is that something like 12-step program really provides an avenue. It's not the magic cure. We're talking about responsibility tonight. I think it comes down to me as an addict taking responsibility, but 12-step program, in my mind, is one of the best tools that I can use as an addict. I think if you look at any addiction, you can cut the numbers any way you want, because we look at somebody relapses, do they come back? Does that count? Is it a slip? Is it a relapse? Is it, how many times have been in treatment? It's like it's so complex, you can't really ever do anything but compare apples and oranges. So that said, Smart Recovery. I think Smart Recovery is terrific. I send clients to Smart Recovery all the time. For those that don't know it, Smart Recovery is, it can be an alternate to 12-step program, but it can also be a collateral thing. I've sent clients to both, and they get things out of both. It's as opposed to 12-step programs, which are self-run. Smart Recovery leaders, the groups are led, facilitated by people that have to be certified in their curriculum, and it tends to be more psychologically oriented, more cognitively oriented, making decision lists of pluses and minuses of certain actions, and understanding thoughts and challenging negative thoughts and that sort of thing. It's very useful. It skips the spirituality piece, which a 12-step program, of course, has. I think people ultimately miss something without that. And in my experience, my clients that go to Smart Recovery go for a while, and then it doesn't seem to be a lifelong support system. It's more like a class. That may be different in different places. Now, Seeking Integrity, we're 12-step oriented for sure. That doesn't mean that we wouldn't send somebody to Smart Recovery, to Refuge Recovery, to other kinds of alternative recovery programs. But all of us have really committed a significant amount of our time to 12-step programs. So that's really what we know. That's what we live. That's what we have implemented and woven into our treatment program. I might add, I have 3 other people in the company, and we're a small company. What, 6, 7 have in the 30s, 30 years. Over a century of recovery among us in a small group. Plus Scott's 15, and others I'm sure I'm not thinking of. So there are many avenues, but I think in my mind, 12-step program is really one of the better ones in terms of that.
Yeah, unlike David, I am familiar with that book. There's a lot of bad science behind the reasoning in that book. 12-step programs aren't perfect. Smart Recovery isn't perfect. Nothing is perfect. But and whatever works for you is what you should do. And I think in AA, for instance, the numbers are actually quite a bit higher than 10%. But as David said, some of the addictions is just very hard to get sober. But those statistics also don't take into account the fact that some people come in, they slip and slide for a year, and then suddenly they figure it out, and then they get sober and stay sober forever.
Right.
So when I'm saying bad science, that's part of the bad science in that book.
Yeah.
There's actually research that shows, if you stay sober for a year, your odds of staying sober for the rest of your life are very high. No matter what the addiction is. So.
Right. And it increases dramatically too. With a few years sober, it's really high. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, so we've got a follow-up to the professor question. She says she spoke last night with a colleague that had this individual as a student, and the colleague said that he's very insecure and defensive when it comes to accepting ideas from women. That kind of cut through the fantasy a little bit.
Huh. Okay. That might have been a little gift for you, that conversation. There's a technique in sex addiction called fantasy contamination, which gets a little tricky because it can be very triggering to do with people. But basically, what that kind of happened for you last night in that conversation, where the bubble was burst a little bit. You sort of maybe saw a different side of him that is probably much more real than the version in your fantasy life. So I think that was actually a nice opportunity for you to kind of get a reality check on that. And I think your reaction is great. You heard it, you accepted it. A lot of people just kind of would deny something like that and sort of dive back into their fantasy. So yeah, good for you.
Yeah, we do an exercise with sex addicts where we want them to play their fantasy through to the worst logical conclusion, which, arrest, getting fired, divorce, that kind of thing. I think you got a dose of that last night. So, so our next question here is about, it's a follow-up on how do you identify the cause of addiction? And let's say when the time is appropriate, when the time is right, how do you identify the cause or causes?
Right. So, like I said before, I think it kind of falls off the shelf. I think you'd think it'd be obvious if someone had a history of abuse as a child or some really dysfunctional family, that it would be kind of clear that might be related to their addictive processes as adults. And it's not always. A lot of times kids who've had abuse don't have many memories, for example, before the age of 6. They don't really remember. I had a client recently who really had just terrible abuse and neglect, but he didn't see it. He wasn't until I gave him some books and we started talking about it. His like jaw has dropped because he realizes, oh my God, that he knew they were kind of troubled, but he didn't realize the extent of the trouble in his family system and how it's impacted him as an adult. So I think when the time is right, I don't know an addict who had a perfect childhood. I don't think the two go together. I think addiction derives from early life challenges, and that can be any number of things. But I think, and that doesn't mean that everybody who has early life challenges is going to become an addict. But I think most people that do grow up to become addicts, have had some kind of those challenges, and it does. And as I say, it's not always obvious. Sometimes it takes the work of a therapist. There's some really great trauma techniques like EMDR, which I do. I do hypnotherapy as well, but that kind of go back and help people resolve some of that stuff that's still affecting their lives, even in ways they don't understand. I use the analogy of software with kids when they're growing up in a dysfunctional home, take in things, they learn things, they believe things about themselves. If they're told they're a piece of crap, or if they're never going to amount to anything, or if the parents are fighting, they take responsibility for that, they believe that. they take it in. And so as we grow, those things kind of fade into the background. We become adults. We start thinking. We build an ego on top of that early stuff. But really, in my experience, it's really operating like a software in the background, almost at a subconscious level. The thoughts, my God, I am a piece of shit. Sorry, the piece of crap. That kids really believe, and they believe it as adults still, and that often fuels the addiction. So long way of saying, I think it has a good therapist, a good sponsor, good meetings, and time, and I think it will become clear. Sometimes I've seen it kind of pieced together by really looking at one's behavior, by getting feedback from people and starting to see patterns in like how I react to certain situations, how I react to certain people in my life as an adult. Gee, what does that mean? Where did I learn that? Or these beliefs or those assumptions, and kind of working backwards, like pulling a thread and working backwards. But it can be a long process, and it can be an arduous and intense emotional process. So care is always encouraged.
Yeah, most healthy people, non-addicts, they're having a bad day or a really strong emotion, they'll turn to other people, friends and family, for emotional support and soothing and regulation. Addicts, we don't do that. Usually it's because, almost always, it's because we learned really early in life that other people can't be trusted. They're not consistently there for us. They're not there for us in healthy ways. So we go to something we can trust. A substance, which makes us feel a certain way, makes us forget that we were sad, or a behavior like sex or porn or masturbation or whatever. That's there's some thought that porn addicts, just by early exposure to porn, are getting addicted, with or without early life trauma, but that's very, very new with the internet, and I still suspect there's always early life trauma. Genetics can predispose you. It's trauma that puts us over the edge.
Right.
So we got a whole bunch of. Why is the 12-step program so good in your mind?
Well, I guess just because it saved my life personally. I didn't know any other program, by the way. 40 years ago, there was very little treatment out there. I think Hazelden was just starting. I was in New York City. There was a place called Rutgers, but not many places to go. And so 12-step program was really the option for me. And I didn't question it. I jumped in and it worked. I think there are many aspects of why I think it's so good, but one is that progression of the steps. If I look at processes as a therapist, clinical processes, or some spiritual exercises, they all follow the kind of same progression as the steps outline. It's a progression of personal development, personal responsibility, personal connection. It's a broadening of oneself in a way that I had no clue how to do. And the steps really provide a step-by-step guide to that. And so I think that, combined with the fellowship connection, or the social piece, which is essential, and for me, the spiritual piece. And I'll just say, for me, in my 40 years, I've been all over the place spiritually, but where I've kind of landed is more kind of energy. I'm a big believer in different kinds of energy, and that works for me. AA doesn't, or 12-step program don't dictate. They're not religious. They dictate the need for a spiritual connection, whatever that is. And I think, to me, that is simply something that means there's something bigger than me. And I really needed that. And for me, when I first came into the program many years ago, the group was my higher power, my spiritual connection. I couldn't fathom anything, and I was too angry at anything up there anyway. But the group, I could trust the group after a while. So for those reasons, I think it's brilliant. If you look at the original literature, it's dated, it's somewhat sexist and all that. But I think, well, being kind. But I think but the concepts are quite brilliant in my mind.
Yeah, there's a saying, addiction is an intimacy disorder, and the cure for addiction isn't sobriety; it's connection. And for me, that's what I found in 12-step rooms is connection, and I learned how to trust people and to be trustworthy, and and this working the steps. David hit that. There's a lot of good instruction, but you can get that in Smart Recovery. You can get it in group therapy. You can get it in a church basement. It's a church meeting instead of an AA meeting.
Right.
For me, the key is connecting on an emotionally intimate level with other people who are dealing with issues similar to my own. I don't think I would get nearly as much if I went to a gambling addicts, Gamblers Anonymous, whatever, because I don't gamble. I need to be around alcoholics, drug addicts, and sex addicts because those are my issues. And whether it's 12 steps or somewhere else, I need those people.
Yeah.
So if the addict refuses to take responsibility for his behavior and continues his narcissistic, addictive behavior, what is the responsibility for the spouse? Just calling out the behavior, or is calling out the behavior or ignoring the behavior better?
Yeah. So I think one of the most painful things is when an addict persists, right, in their addictive behavior and doesn't take that responsibility and continues to act out in that narcissistic way you've talked about. And it really puts the spouse in a difficult position because if they care about the person, they care about not only the person as an individual, but they may care about that person as a father and husband, about the welfare of their family, about the safety of their kids and the security of the roof over their home, and just all of that starts to come into play. And so I think it becomes really important, first of all, the addict take responsibility. If it doesn't, I think that's where good boundaries have to come in and a good plan. I think that the spouse needs a really strong support system, their own advocate. By that I mean their own therapist, their own group of people around them, social support, ideally a 12-step meeting or group that really can rally and provide the feedback. Because when a partner is in the middle of that, there's so many strong emotions flying around. And I've been a partner of an addict as well. It's confusing. You want to jump in, you want to try to fix. I don't know what I want. I don't know what I need. I don't know what I need to say. I just know that this is a terrible situation. I just kind of want it to stop. And I think, so in those moments, my ability to kind of discern what the appropriate course of action is really limited. And I think that's where the engagement of that social group around me and my sponsor and maybe my therapist can really be helpful. Because in those moments, I think we're flying blind and we really need to trust the opinions of people around us who can give us a much more objective opinion. I think most partners have tried the nagging route. Most partners have tried the fix-it route. We've tried everything, right? It's out of desperation. But I think at some point, we have to kind of take that back, put up some boundaries, put up some expectations, and turn that responsibility back to the addict. And that's hard to do sometimes, and especially if the addict doesn't want to take it. But that kind of behavior is not the partner's responsibility, it's the addict's. And I think if the addict can't take it, then the partner needs to go to plan B, whatever that is, but not to continue the engagement and the frustration and the emotional pain of that.
Yeah, there's some great stuff for partners in Dr. Rob's book, Prodependence, which I think you've read. If you haven't, email me, I'll send you a copy. Michelle Mays has a blog called partnerhope.com, all one word, partnerhope.com. She's got a ton of stuff about this question. Go there, check that out. Let's see, let's go down here. We got a comment, Gabor Mate, how do you pronounce that, David?
I think Mate, Gabor Mate.
Okay, says something like, not all traumatized people become addicts, but all addicts have been traumatized. That's totally.
Yeah, I mean, that's so true, because as we know, what can be a traumatizing event for one person doesn't affect a second person that way, and has to do with resilience and all kinds of other factors. But so trauma doesn't actually always lead to addiction or other kinds of problems. But it's true, I think, that most people who become addicts have some kind of trauma or adverse experiences in their background, for sure.
Yeah, and one of the things to add on to that trauma specialists will always tell you is trauma that's dealt with immediately doesn't stick around. Trauma that's ignored is what gets us. It gets worse. It festers. It goes bad.
I want to just add too, as a trauma therapist, most people think of trauma as, being in a tsunami, or having a war injury, or a terrible car accident, or that kind of thing, and those are indeed trauma. But there's also, we know from studies now that sort of lower grade chronic trauma can reap the same results. So, for example, bullying, chronic bullying, it may not be on the same par as a tragic car accident, but if a kid is bullied over the course of his school career, he's going to end up with trauma, or could. Won't say, but he could. And I think so. It's important to understand. I think that's another reason why people sometimes can't figure it out. They think, well, I wasn't traumatized, but they were bullied and teased, or by their family, by their peers, and that can lead to traumatic response as well.
Yeah. So a great question here. I love this one. For many reasons, how many relapses does the typical sex addict have prior to eventually becoming sober and not relapsing anymore? I'm sure this is very individual, but what is the norm from your experience?
Yikes. Well, I can't really put a number on that. I mean, it's so highly individualized. I've had clients who got it like right away. I've never had anybody get it without any kind of slip or relapse. But I think I've had some people get it quickly, get into solid recovery. Some people take their time. The same is true with chemsex or the stimulants, where there's a lot of relapse, just like there is for sex addiction. But I think with treatment and with program and with awareness, people start to, again, going back to our theme tonight of responsibility, they understand that they're going to have these cues, they're going to have triggers and cravings, but they know how to take responsibility for managing them in a healthy way. So I think that's an important factor to take into account as well in that regard. So I don't think there's any number. I don't think anybody can tell you a number. I don't know, Scott, do you have a thought on that?
Sex addiction is a lot like an eating disorder. You can't stop eating. We're not going to stop being sexual. It's part of we're hardwired as sexual beings, because we need to be sexual to procreate and further the species, just like we need to eat. So it's not like alcohol where you don't need it in your life. And I know plenty of people who went to an AA meeting, their very first one, they never had another drink. They're 30, 40 years sober now. I'm like David. I don't know anybody who has not slipped at least once or twice in sex addiction recovery. And I don't know anybody with an eating disorder who hasn't slipped once or twice either. It's just a different animal. The norm is that we will slip and slide for a while. My goal early on was, is my life getting any better? Well, it was getting a little better, but I had some slips and things. And eventually I got sober and life got a lot better. But, my sponsees, when they're struggling early on, I tell them, is your life better today than when you started recovery? And the answer is inevitably yes, unless they've had some legal consequence that came to roost.
Right. So, I would add to that too, that people do slip, but in my experience with program and some recovery, the slip is shorter. They get back sooner. It seems to be less damaging. There's no guarantee for that. But I think in my experience, both with meth and sex addiction, people kind of catch themselves quickly. I had a client I'm aware of recently that had he was a meth user, really terrible meth user for a long time, had 3 or 4 months clean and used, but he only used for 4 hours. And then he came to a meeting. So I think it kind of does program does kind of ruin the addiction, right? It spoils the effect of it. But I think with the process addictions, gambling, sex, food, and meth to extent, relapse is a big part of the game.
I want to get this question in. I found out about my mom sleeping with multiple men that weren't my dad. They were in a long distance relationship, and this shattered me. Do you know of support groups for adult children of sex and love addicts? Also, is there a difference between narcissism and addiction? So let's take the first question first. Support groups for adult children of sex and love addicts.
I don't know of specific groups for the children. Do you, Scott?
No, but I would think you could go to COSA, COSA, or S-Anon. I think it's S-ANON. Look those groups up. Those are mostly for partners of sex addicts, but I would think
the dynamics would be the same, really, for the most part. So I think, it'd be, and I really encourage you to get some help for that, because that is, of course, a shock. And it's be important for you to get some experience from other people that would help you get through that, for sure. For sure.
Is there a difference between narcissism and addiction?
Wow. Well, not much. I was trying to think of the thing like,
you can be a narcissist and not be addicted, but if you're an addict, you're probably a narcissist.
And that's what I was going to say. It's one of those things we just talked about before, where not every narcissist is an addict, but I think most addicts have some element of narcissism in them. And I think it's interesting too, because there's so much relation between amphetamine use and sex addiction. Which is why we treat those in tandem and at Seeking Integrity. But I think of those two groups, I think there's a lot of narcissism, maybe more than for other drugs, like for an alcoholic. Although every addict has a bit of narcissism, which really is that the world revolves around me, and addiction by its very nature really kind of kills empathy, right? Which is one of the factors of a narcissist. They don't have empathy. They don't feel what other people are feeling. And that's certainly true with addictive behavior. It will really impair empathy. So even if you're not a narcissist to start, I think addicts kind of become very self-centered, very egocentric and narcissistic. So that's a problem. Not every narcissist is an addict, but I would say every addict has a good bit of narcissism in them, for sure.
We have somebody who's about to start their step 4. Any guidance or tips on that?
So step 4 is a really major, it's kind of that inventory piece that people are afraid to dive into sometimes, or I've seen it two ways. Sometimes people go too fast. They get kind of overwhelmed by it. Sometimes they put it off and make more of a big deal out of it than it is. It's another step of 12. But I think I would use really polish up on some of the grounding techniques we've talked about here in terms of how to get centered, how to do some breathing before you sit down to write or meditate, how to picture grounding cords going down into the earth, do some progressive relaxation, all those things to kind of help you contain yourself, because you're really digging around in really powerful stuff. So you need those tools. The other thing I would say before you start your 4th step is to really make sure all your social connections are really strong and healthy, and that people know you're doing this, people are supporting you for it. You don't try to do it in one big chunk, but you take it at a pace that's reasonable, and you get feedback as you're going. I think people either try to go through it too fast to get past it, or they kind of agonize over every detail in a way that's not necessary, in my opinion, for the 4th step. So be kind to yourself. I guess that's the takeaway is be gentle and don't do it alone. Obviously you're going to have to do your own work alone, but make sure you're surrounded by people that love and care about you and that know the process you're going in. Because if they've gone through it, they remember how it was, and they can be very helpful.
Yeah, I would just add that for me, step 4 was a game changer. It's where I uncovered all the shit and took responsibility, which takes us back to today's topic of responsibility. I jokingly say I thought everyone else was the asshole, and I found out I was. That's what step 4 did for me. And then I was ready to do the rest of the work, about kind of changing my behavior.
Yeah. Yeah.
So definitely do it wholeheartedly, but ground. We have one more question, and just enough time to address it. My paternal grandmother committed suicide when my mother was 6 months along with me. You think that was trauma for me?
Yeah, I would say so. I mean, there's been a lot of studies of in utero situations and going on in the world, and fascinating studies of families that were financially stressed when the mother was pregnant, and that has an impact on the child and the birth, on overall health. Babies absorb stuff. They're hardwired into their mother, and if the mother experiences emotional trauma, all those stress hormones go right into the fetus. It's a direct connection. And so, yes, of course, when I'm doing a history with somebody of trauma, I always ask, what was going on in your family? Your father just lost his job when your mother was pregnant, or was there a death in the family, or had a war broken out, or all these things that really do play into the emotional well-being of the mother, which translates directly to that child. So yes, I totally, this is going back to my kind of hypnotherapy roots, but yeah, I think I've seen some of the amazing connections that people make based on stuff that happened before they were born, but when they were in the womb, it has a profound effect. So yes, I would consider that trauma.
And then after you're born, there's all that grief in the air. I mean, you were born 3 months later. That's not enough time for your dad and your mom to get over the suicide of a parent. So they're still grieving while they're trying to care for a baby,
Right. Which, by the way, could lead, there's a great book by Enid Gray called Neglect, and it has a subtitle I can't remember. But basically, the idea is that it's not always overt physical, sexual, emotional abuse, but neglect, just kind of parents not being available emotionally or around, or being preoccupied with a sibling or whatever, that can really impact and create trauma as well. So there's many angles to this, but yeah, I would definitely look at that as a factor.
The author is Enid Gray, Enod Gray, Gray, I believe. That's how she spells her last name. And the title of the book is Neglect, with some big long subtitle that I tried to talk her out of. So, anyway, we are out of time, everybody. Good crowd tonight. Lots of great questions. David, anything you want to say before we sign out?
No, I just appreciate all the questions and the feedback. It was great. Good interaction.
Okay. Thank you, everybody. We'll see you next week.
Okay. Thanks, everybody. Bye-bye. Bye, Scott.
Bye.